because somebody wrote a letter about Rodney Davis or something. And there's always like, I'll see what the other ones are, the pictures. That's what there's always.
I know.
Means you're doing something right, I feel like.
Surprisingly, the people who contact me the first year, I mainly got the crazies. And last year, I get people who are either seriously grappling with issues and want to discuss them, or I get positive. But I know those that online commentary, that sounds like
the comments. I always say don't read the comment section. I remember I had a friend who was like, "Yo, they're saying this thing inside the comment section." She posted on Facebook like, "Everybody, we gotta go here and defend it." And then some people try to argue like, "Yo, go to the comment section." And, she was having a little like, "I don't know."
Going live
is probably the most outspoken radical person.
Going live being the most hard, I guess. Out of this. I don't see. And thanks for listening to Start Radio. You are listening to WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial, streaming live at WEFT.org. Listen to Root Stock Radio every Monday at 5:30 on WEFT Community Radio. Coming up next is In the Know, a new public affairs show hosted by Sherry Williams. After that, Champaign-Urbana Radio Theater will be on at 7. Monday night R&R at 8. Live local music on WEFT sessions at 10, and recorded local music on Champaign Local 901 at 11. We're going to get to some brief underwriting, and then we're going to kick off a brand new show here on WEFT with Sherry Williamson. So stay tuned. None of the mics are on, so you don't have to whisper. Okay.
But even Brian,
Be over 15 seconds. Okay.
They're debating whether or not you should come there and argue. Different points in the comment section. Brian Donner was like,
okay, she's going to go back live 7 seconds.
Yeah.
All right, good evening, CU community. You're listening to WEFT 90.1. Welcome to In the Know, a public affairs show where social issues, trending topics, relevant research, and important perspectives are discussed so the listener can be in the know. This evening, we'll be having a candid discussion on racism, examining what racism truly looks like, what living with racism means, identifying local race issues, and what can be done to effectively address racism. I'm going to have my guests introduce themselves. We have 3 amazing guests who have backgrounds regarding addressing different types of issues under the racial umbrella. We'll start over here to our left.
Sundiata Cha-Jua, teach in the Department of African American Studies and History at the University of Illinois, and I write for the News Gazette.
Kyle Patterson, and I currently serve in the Champaign County Board and the Champaign County Mental Health Board.
So my name is James Tinsley. I'm an undergrad student at the University of Illinois, majoring in political science, and also a county board member representing District 11.
So we are going to jump right into this issue. We had the incident in Charlottesville that happened recently, but we know that this has been something that we've seen in our society for a long time, and it seems like it's been escalating. Is that kind of the impression that you get? That I know I've had different people, friends, family who've said that it seemed like we realized there was maybe a foolish sense of security around the idea of race before the most recent presidential election. And since then, now we've seen that maybe we haven't made as many steps forward. What do you feel as far as like the work you see, the community that you're in right now? How do you feel we are with that?
I'll go first. One quote that always sticks out to me is one by Will Smith, who says, "Racism isn't getting worse; it's getting filmed." And so I really agree with that. And in today's era of technology, a lot of times, there's a lot of things that get put right out there, and it's for the whole world to see right then and there. So it's immediate. And in regards to our new POTUS, I just think it can be argued that some of his rhetoric and promises within congressional purposes can be enticing to some of extremist who might feel like now is the time they've been given the green light. So, I think, now is just a situation to where, with today's era, it's just very much more available for the public to see, and it can't be hidden, like it may have been able to be several years ago.
Yeah, I think in regards to that, social media, I think, allows for a lot of the term keyboard cowboys who feel that protection, that anonymity of sitting behind their computer and being able to spout off whatever they want to say when it comes to a variety of different topics without really having to have that ownership or accountability. So I think social media can play into it, like what you were saying with your quote. There's a lot more movement with people expressing themselves, but I think because we're not connecting as organically as we used to, we're not having to have that accountability on a lot of different levels. What were you going to say, Kyle?
I was going to, I think that kind of go what James was speaking to as far as the reality that Donald Trump has really kind of opened a lot of people's eyes to the racism, but white supremacy is not something that's new. It's not necessarily even something that comes in waves. It's something that's ever existing. It's just in sometimes different volumes. I mean, when you look at Donald Trump's most controversial things he ran on that were deemed as racist, building a wall that's not something new. It's not that Donald Trump came up with this. I think it's more of that he says it more bluntly. He says what he means. You have Republicans who for many years have talked about, well, before we do reform, we need to secure our border. And that's the term they use. And it's like dog whistle, it's code. Right. And, you look at, he's not the first person to propose putting restrictions on Muslim countries. And he's not the first person to bring up the idea of, slowing immigration or targeting those types of groups. It's just that people said it politely. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the big difference there.
Right.
I want to disagree rather stringently with both of my colleagues here. One, I think on the question of whether or not something is increasing, trending up, or trending down, or is flat, we got to establish the time frame, right, in order to make that determination. The other thing is that, and I don't want to sound elitist, but Will Smith should never be used as a source talking about anything that involves an understanding of social reality. What I mean by that is simply he doesn't read journals, he doesn't keep up with this issue. He's simply a celebrity and you don't know what the hell he's talking about. So let's start with an understanding of what racism is. I think in your comments, James, you were largely responding to terrorism, the use of physical violence. You're speaking in terms of Charlottesville, the Charleston massacre. And that's certainly the most stark form that racism takes. But at the end of the day, racism is about institutions, social networks, and structural oppression. And in that sense, then I would suggest this. Let's use the standard understanding of what social indicators are. So we're looking at things that measure quality of life. That could be how long, longevity, right? How long you live. It can be housing, whether or not one owns a house. It can be incarceration. It can be healthcare. That if we use those standard social indicators, one of the things that we find is that there's a tremendous leap in the improvement of the quality of life for African American people as a consequence of the civil rights and Black Power movements. But that wave of, we'll use the term progress for lack of another term, that wave of improvement runs a Baki decision that begins to roll back affirmative action. And then there's a real down period in the 80s under Reagan. I mean, a real down period. And there's a brief blip up during the Clinton years in some social indicators. In others, there's a deep dive. The Clintons are responsible for mass incarceration, right? That neoliberal democratic agenda is as racist as anything the Republicans have ever uttered. Now, then you see a downturn with the continuation of a downturn under Bush, and you begin to see some blip upwards in some things under Obama and a deep dive in some ways under Obama. So it becomes mixed. But at the end of the day, if we want to focus on terrorism, we got two forms, right? One form is private violence, meaning regular citizens and residents who enact racist violence. So we are talking about someone like Timothy McVeigh. We're talking about Dylan Storm Ruth, right? But on the other hand, we also have the terrorism of the state, police violence. I think we can categorically say that there is a period, the most recent period, has been an escalation in private racial violence. Certainly the Southern Poverty Law Center, and there's an institute at California State Northridge that measures the numbers of white supremacists and hate organizations and their membership. They show a decided uptick from the beginning of Trump's campaign to now, a decided uptick. We also see a decided uptick in private racial violence in the 2 years that we've been inert with Donald Trump and his brand of fascism. In terms of police violence, because of the mass resistance to it, we've actually seen a slight downturn in terms of the number of black people police kill. Now, just this afternoon, my wife sent me a newspaper article that appeared in the black online newspaper called The Root. And it's about an 8-year-old boy who is alleged to be they use the term biracial, and his classmates lynched him. He didn't die, but he was able to pull the rope off, but they put him in a chair, put a noose around his neck, strung him up, kicked the chair out from under him, and he was fortunate enough that he was able to struggle and pull the rope off. Those kinds of blatant acts have increased under Donald Trump. What Donald Trump has done is he rolled the rock back from the cave, and these white supremacists and white nationalists have slithered forth and become part of mainstream America. They're no longer in the dark. That is a significant transformation.
So, I think we see even, among the guests here that, we have different outlooks on what racism is. And I think that's one of the ways, like you're talking about, people being able to kind of slither around under different masks and trying to, get away from the accountability. Do you think the definition of racism has changed within the last decade, where people are either more trying to, trivialize what true racism is, saying that, this act that I did or this act that was done or whatever we see in the headlines, that's not really based on racism. That's a misconception or miscommunication. Do you think that we're seeing, racism being redefined?
I mean, when you make reference to the idea of people downplaying things as not being racist, I think in a matter of a few years, we've gone from people saying that choosing not to hire black people is not racist or something like that. And now it's to the point of people saying, well, the Nazis aren't that bad. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's a pretty dramatic change, that we can't have an incident in Charlottesville and have everybody be united in saying that, Nazis are bad. And I think that through Donald Trump, he has, as Sundiata referred to, is mainstream that sort of mindset. This is not the first wave of Nazis, of fascists, of white supremacists. It comes in waves. And this is certainly a high point, but in the past, it was never as close to an even divide as far as society goes of supporting or opposing those groups. It was pretty much universally like, okay, Nazis aren't good. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we're at a new point. I think it's because the wave that they're riding on is the president of the United States of America, somebody who was, the nominee of a major party. And I think that he brought it in through this sort of mainstream way. And then these guys dressed like hipsters in their khakis and polos, new costume for the white supremacy sort of snuck in looking very normal, And so, in many ways, I think that we're seeing something that we weren't seeing a few years ago, even in that specific realm.
I don't think that racism, it has morphed, right? But I don't think that it's changed too substantively from previous years, meaning that it has always been a combination of structural oppression or institutional oppression and individual behavior. But what's changed dramatically is that since the end of civil rights and Black Power movements, the society came to construct racism as simply and predominantly individual acts. And the questions of institutions and structures have been ripped out of it. So unless it's Charleston Massacre, unless it's Charlottesville, unless it's the attack on this 8-year-old boy attempt to lynch him, it's not seen as racism. And I think that was essentially the point that Cal was making. And what we have to do is something that's very difficult in America, because we train our youth to only think in terms of individuals and not to think in terms of groups when society is composed of groups, and not to think in terms of institutions and the ways in which institutions affect groups of people. And so once we begin to look at institutional impact, and again, oftentimes it's not as dramatic, but the impact is certainly has greater determination of whether or not people live and the quality of the life they live. And what we have to do is focus and keep people focused on institutions rather than just the extremely outrageous behavior of the white supremacists and the white nationalists. But we got to look at ordinary folks, white Americans, and how these institutions, how they run their institutions. Meaning that we have to understand racism as a series of rules, regulations, policies, and laws that produce disparate outcomes on the basis of race.
So, we've talked about, the different influences that contribute to racism, and it's gone as far up the hill as the President of the United States, setting a dangerous precedence, I think. A lot of people feel that it opened the gate to, kind of this free-for-all in some ways of maybe practices that, like you were saying, were politely done, or people kind of coming under the guise of, well, it's not really racism, I just disagree with the way this works. Now it's just, I don't have to, necessarily mince my words anymore. And so we know that the politics and our elected officials can definitely help or hurt the climate in society. What other systems, because we've referenced systems now, what other systems do you feel are some of the bigger contributors to the racism that we see? Not even just nationally, but even locally in our own community.
Well, I'd say the first system off top would be the judicial system. Here locally, we have countless numbers of people who deal with issues of recidivism, backdraws of criminal records and stuff like that. So when you deal with that type of scrutiny and shall I say mark on you, it's just hard for it's hard for anybody to progress. And then when you put them back, in most cases back in the same circumstances that they were in, then it's not only put them in the same circumstances that they were in, but 9 out of 10 maybe limiting them to keep from leaving those areas. Then it's sometimes it just sets up a system for failure. And I really think that's one of the main contributors here locally, especially, that leads to, a lot of crime in this area. Would you want to comment on that?
I do. For me, the key question is what I'll call the marginalization of Black labor. So we're talking about the fact that African Americans and Black people in the U.S. are always more than 2 times the marginalization of Black labor, that there are always more than 2 times the percentage of white people who are unemployed. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that sets the basis for everything else. Because what we end up with, once Black people no longer play a central role in the economy, then the question is, what do you do with these people? In effect, African Americans have become superfluous. And so the question is, how do you deal with that large superfluous population? And one solution is mass racialized incarceration, right? The other solution is to let the schools, the public schools, die, to make them, public schools were created to mitigate class differences and to create opportunity for everyone, regardless of class, race, etc. Well, what we've seen since the Civil Rights and Black Power movement and Black people's quote-unquote integration into the public school situation has been the systematic defunding of public education. And so when you have something like the state of Illinois now agree that those people who say we opt out of the common good, i.e. the public school system, and what we want to do, we want to put our kids in schools where they don't have to interact with Blacks and Latinos, and we want the public to refund us for our racist decision. Okay, it's those kinds of things. And we can take every institution in this society and we can show the ways in which they operate in a deeply racist manner that reinforces, right? That reinforces a situation in which Black people are degraded, and thus we become open for all kinds of attacks, in which Black people suffer, and the disparate outcomes of every social indicator in this society. And it's that totality that makes me argue that the current moment is a new nadir, a new low for Black people.
A lot of times you hear, I think this is probably an argument that's been around forever, that it's not up to society to bring certain demographics out of poverty or to give them that quote unquote leg up, that they are supposed to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and take care of it, handle their business. If you're in a situation where you're a single parent or even a two-family home, you're living in poverty, and as they argue, you just happen to be of a certain race, it's up to you, it's your obligation to be able to take care of your family. However, a lot of activists will say, when there are basically obstacles, there are bars and limitations to being able to access the same resources as those who are in a higher demographic, middle class, upper middle class. How do you respond to that when it's again, I think we're looking at segregation in a lot of different ways when it comes to access to institutions, even financial institutions, you have different, buy-ins and things, like you said, with the education system. What's your response when people say, just because you're Black doesn't mean that affirmative action necessarily has to be the thing that comes in and sweeps you off and pushes you forward?
I just say, it's easy to say that, when arguably you might not necessarily have any systematic handicaps. Not saying that most Blacks don't. I'm not saying Blacks do have any, systematic handicaps, but I'm saying, it's the ratio for Blacks to have systematic, loopholes or obstacles in their progression is very much more, higher. And when I say that, I mean just going back to, when you think of, most lower income areas, here locally specifically, you have a dense Black population where, a lot of people, employment is scarce and, there's a lot of idle time and, like I covered this, that can lead to, idle circumstances. So with that being said, it's almost like you how do I want to say this? It's almost like kind of being like, starting off behind, starting off in the negative. And, sometimes, when you're actually in it, it doesn't feel like, it feels like it's just a way of life. You know what I'm saying? Until, you get to, you're fortunate enough to get to a level where you might be enlightened and learn more about it. But until then, it just seems like it's just a way of life. So some people don't even understand that there's a setback. You know what I'm saying? They just think it's the norm, until, they realize that, I guess until they're enlightened and knowing the difference. I, for one, I didn't, I feel like, for a long time, I was very lost in, where I thought my potential lied. And as I got older and, was able to, put myself around good people, I was able to learn more about not only my circumstances, but my peers' circumstances. Mm-hmm. And through that, I guess it just gave me the, the will to progress. And, some people don't have that opportunity.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, I come from a family where, like, my grandfather had a third grade education. He didn't know how to give all my aunts and uncles. He didn't know how to show them how to do their homework. All he could really do was instill in them the will to get the homework. You know what I'm saying? And, like, even now, as I got older with my mom, you know what I'm saying? Like, she, had got her associates out of college, but she still worked 3 jobs. So she couldn't actually oversee me doing my homework. All she could really instill in me was, you have to do this. You have to do this. And is to me, like, that doesn't seem like much, but it seems like, there's so many people who didn't even have that. You know what I'm saying? So, like, I feel like for whatever reason, you know what I'm saying, those in themselves can be, kind of setbacks, you know what I'm saying, that a lot of blacks don't have in our community. You know what I'm saying? You gotta think about it. We live in an area where, think about Section 8, you know what I'm saying, it'll supply, a black woman's food, housing, insurance. All she has to do is keep a black man out of the home. You know what I'm saying? And from that, you know what I'm saying, there are drawbacks, you know what I'm saying, that might not even be acknowledged until, you know what I'm saying, later on down the road. Would somebody like to chime in on that?
I mean, I just guess try to keep it simple. I mean, you look at any measurement of success, economic, employment, education. You look at the disproportionate incarceration in policing. Black Americans, particularly black men. I don't see, if you don't believe that the system is racist, then you believe that African Americans are inherently inferior. Simply put, because the numbers are there. When you look at drug use, I think even a larger portion of white people use drugs than black people. And then you look at the targeting and the prosecutions, 60-70% of the population of that by a group of people that make up less than 15% of the population. Right. And I think that the numbers are undeniable. So either society is systematically racist, or you think blacks are inferior, which makes you racist.
I had a discussion with somebody, this is a discussion we've had ongoing for a while, where we were talking about the war on drugs and, drug addiction. And now that we have essentially the white soccer mom out in the suburbs who now is addicted to opiates, now we have a drug problem, versus when Tyrone was addicted to crack in the 80s, that wasn't an issue. And so exactly what you're saying, how we're looking at these institutions, how we're looking at these systems, and how they apply to the different demographics, exactly what Kyle is saying. When it was somebody back in the 80s who was of color and had an addiction, well, that was part of their culture. That's just their problem. And, you need to figure out how to handle that. Versus now, wow, now we have this affecting a different demographic. We have, like I said, the white soccer mom who has an addiction. Now we need to figure out where we went wrong as a society so we can help her. And so I think, like you were saying, really, unless you've experienced any type of discrimination, you don't recognize what that looks like within these systems. You're not seeing it.
Not to mention, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to raise the question about how we conceptualize these things. Mm-hmm. And I certainly, I really appreciate the way Cal phrased that at the end of the day, it really is, if you deny racial oppression, then the only alternative that would explain the conditions in which black people and brown people find themselves is their inferiority. Mm-hmm. But let's do this question of an obstacle. I think of an obstacle as something that's in your path, but it's not active, right? That's an obstacle. When I was a teenager in high school, we played an all-white team. We had an all-black team. And we were up by 5 points with 5 seconds to go. And we had the ball and lost the game. The referee wasn't an obstacle. The referee was actively cheating. American society is actively putting rules, regulations, policies, and allowing behavior to take place that systematically works against us. These things are not static. They're not neutral. They're actively working against us. So when people begin to talk these crazy things about pull yourself up from your bootstrap, there's 2 ways to respond, right? One way is to say, When the hell have white people pulled themselves up from their bootstrap, right? And what that means is this. White people don't want to talk about the Homestead Act, where they got free land. They don't want to talk about the policies of the New Deal, the Housing Act of 1948, that allowed them to move in the suburbs. You could only get loans if you moved into the suburbs, and by law, suburbs had to be homogeneous racially, right? They don't want to talk about the discrimination written into the GI Bill, right? They don't want to talk about every business in this society. Every major business has been funded by government. The railroad industry got 800 million acres given to them out of public land. And that's just federal. We're not even talking about what the states gave them and every business and every corporation. When it comes to black people and brown people, and then all of a sudden, it's pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Well, I think one of the things you said when we're looking at obstacles and you're defining it, active versus, something that isn't active. I think when you're talking about an active, whatever you want to identify it as, that also assumes accountability. When something is active, that means there's accountability on something that's in motion, essentially. Are they pushing you forward? Are they pushing you backwards? So I like the way that you talked about, this active, because I think for me, when I think of that, there's accountability somewhere, because something isn't just in the way, they just happen to be there. It's you're actively where you are. You're actively in motion in one direction or the other. And so I think that can be where it's tough. People don't want to believe that they are actively playing a part, even if they don't see it as direct, that they are in any way, shape, or form actively contributing to segregation, to racism, to discrimination of any kind. I wanted to read something that you wrote for the News Gazette when you were talking about race, an actual race. It said, the race relates an annual contest between two runners, one white and one black. The black runner has a ball and chain on his right ankle. The white runner has no encumbrances. As the black runner inevitably falls behind, the black audience becomes restless and loudly expresses their anger at the discriminatory rules. During the second lap, a small group of black people burst onto the track and with a hammer and chisel, break the chain on the runner's leg. Free from his restrictions, the black athlete mounts a heroic challenge and nearly catches the white runner at the finish line. Screaming unfair, crowds of blacks dispute the outcome. Initially, the judge reiterates the rules and reminds the audience that these rules have governed the race for centuries. They state chaining the black runner is a tradition. They remind the audience that over the years, at the urging of blacks, they have shortened the chain and reduced the ball's weight. However, given the size and disposition of the protest, some judges offer a compromise. They suggest free running the race immediately. Convinced of its fairness, a majority of the judges support the liberal proposal. And then it goes on to talk about, now the black runner is injured. He has to deal with that as an encumbrance for being able to fairly compete. And so, when we're talking about these different systems, I think that's where people feel like, well, we've given you concessions. What more do you want from us? We're giving you concessions. Where, for instance, one of the things I've not overly liked about local school districts, especially Unit 4, is when we had school of choice. We were trying to make things fair, when really what should have happened is people should have gone back to the drawing board and said, how do we make all of these schools have the exact same resources, exact same funding, versus, well, now people have this perspective or perception that this school is better, so now I'm going to have my child bused across the city to this school. It should be that the school in your neighborhood has the same chance, the same resources, the same funding as that school across town.
That's right.
That's where I feel like the disservice went to. But again, we're looking at systems who are trying to band-aid what has been going on for ages. And so, when we look at these systems, how do we start addressing them in a way where we're not continually putting band-aids on things? We're not continually trying to say that we're doing what's politically correct. How do we move past what essentially I feel like makes people feel better about themselves and go into a place where we're doing what's right?
It's a difficult question. But you got two elected officials here. So I guess I just put it.
Just to keep it short and sweet, I think, for one, programs definitely need municipal support. They need support from their governments. And from there, so long as you're building a relationship, from between the schools, the community, and the government, you know what I'm saying? Like, there should always be progression for education. And I don't think there's a big answer for that. I think it's really cut and dry. The municipal government should be supporting. We should be prioritizing first, education. Because I don't want to sound cliche, but the children are the future. So technically, in a nutshell. So yeah,
Well, and I think we find that that's the argument that comes back is, well, you didn't put enough emphasis in your family on education, and so your child has fallen behind. But have they fallen behind, or are we talking about access in public schools failing?
I think, that's a very difficult, question to answer. I know from an elected official, from my perspective, I believe that, with the powers that be that might be at my disposal, I should, all elected officials should at least do the best of their ability to, allocate and support all, educational funding for children. What's going on at the home, we all want the best circumstances possible for our children. But from our end, we need to do the best we can, and all of the questions, those bridges can be crossed once, we've done our part.
I guess to say I don't necessarily agree with the premise that there is an inevitable point we'll reach to where people will stop being racist, where we can set up a system where we don't have systematic inequalities. I think we can do better than we are right now, and I think that that's possible. To give a political anecdote, I had a colleague who was going door to door getting petition signatures to get on the ballots a few years ago, and they're in some more suburban type neighborhood, and somebody called the police on them. These are two white guys, and the police came and told them what's going on. It's not an issue, and the guy who was running, kind of being a smart aleck, was like, "Hey, you guys could sign my petition." And the officer said, "Oh no, we don't live in Champaign County. We live in a small town, a county over."
Mm-hmm.
And when you have police forces where the people don't live there, their kids don't go to school with the kids that they police. They don't, if they kind of disrespect somebody or do something improper, they don't have to worry about, I might be with my family at the grocery store and run into this person. And when your only interaction, when you live in a completely white county and a completely white town, your only interaction you have as a police officer is through your job, usually specifically, especially if you're not getting out of your car and walking neighborhoods, and if you're just riding in the car, almost your exclusive interactions with African Americans are negative. Right. Because, you show up when somebody's doing something they shouldn't be doing, and then that creates this, a stereotype in people's minds. And I do think that at any job, you begin to dehumanize the people you work with in a certain way. If you work at a restaurant or, it just becomes part of the motion of work. And when you're talking about law enforcement, you're talking about people who are working with people who they're not around. I think that, that's just a small aspect, having things like residency requirements and trying to focus more on doing better in those little ways. I think it's certainly big steps that we could take.
Yeah, now that, we have the option of everybody getting to weigh in on, articles that come up really on any online publication. When one of the articles recently, I remember reading, and they were saying, if you have officers who are serving on different types of committees, boards, whatever it is for Champaign, they should live here. That if you have somebody serving on a board that represents any type of anything for this community, they should live in the community. Because otherwise, like Kyle was saying, if you have somebody who's removed from everything outside of their work hours, how do they have an appreciation for what that really looks like? Are they understanding that, that beyond the interaction that they're even having with that individual, are they understanding the community that person is living in if they aren't living there themselves? So I definitely, agree when you're looking at how to make progress and move forward, you have to be very specific about who your stakeholders are and how they're interacting, because otherwise if you have essentially a misrepresentation of somebody who's saying, oh, things aren't as bad as they are. Well, you live in Monticello.
Right.
You're not quite getting what's happening right here.
And then not only that, I was gonna say I personally know like several police officers who live somewhere around 40 to 50 miles outside of Champaign County. So their day-to-day perspective of some of these lower economic areas in Champaign County is nothing more than a work zone. It's nothing more than just their office, their workspace. So like there's no like Kyle was saying, there's no sense of community inclusion from both sides, and that can leave room for untrust. It's quite evident, and those are just one of the many things we can change. Should be worked towards changing within the community.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that strikes me is that the way in which we are educated in this society, whether it's through the formal system or through socialization, is to not think very logically. And so something as basic as wealth is inherited and poverty is inherited. That if you look at the circumstances upon which African Americans entered into the U.S. as citizens, I'm not talking about slavery, I'm talking about after emancipation, we become citizens in 1870, but we came out of slavery with nothing. Okay? So we entered a game of monopoly with no money, right? And so it should not be shocking that only the lucky and those people who are exceptional are able to continue in the game, i.e. they landed on community, wherever it is.
Boardwalk or something, yeah.
No, not boardwalk. You landed on boardwalk, your ass out.
You out of there, yeah.
They landed on that community square and they get that pool of money that's in there, right? And so over the course of generations, Black people have been impoverished and pushed back. Over the course of generations, white people who had something remained in the game. White people who had a lot, for the most part, went up. And to reject that fundamental question, right? That fundamental reality leads us into a conversation where we can't go anywhere. The other piece, and this is where the Trump and the real racist right wing, see what the liberals, the neoliberal Democrats, Bill Clinton, that criminal, right? Barack Obama, those people, their solution to America's problem was to effectively present the darkening of America. So their thing is, we have to bring in skills from India, right? And Indians in the United States are considered Caucasians. Right? We have to permit we have to further the immigration of Latinos, because half of the Latinos who come in claim to be white and are white. They were white in their country and they function as a racial oligarchy in their country. They behave, white Guatemalans behave toward black Guatemalans the same way white Americans behave toward black Americans. So they're boostering that white class because they're looking to maintain the skill set. Well, the Donald Trump said their position is they still got a little too much of foreigners for us. So we want a wall. We want to keep them out completely. So then the question is, well, how do you continue to develop a society when you've already made a determination that 17% and 13% y'all are giving no resources to, meaning the Latinos that are here and meaning African Americans and other black folk. So then how do you maintain an economy that is going to be competitive in this global market? And that's the problem that Donald Trump and them have, is that their position is, look, we're prepared to let this thing go all the way down because we don't want to bring in skills from outside because they're going to be a little bit too dark, regardless of how they're perceived racially by some white folk. And that's how you explain what's happening with the schools. That's why the disinvestment in the inner city. What society doesn't invest in their core cities? Only the United States. And why don't they invest? Because the cities are so heavily populated by African Americans and Mexican Americans and other people from Latin America. And so they're willing to let this shit crumble. That's the reality.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about, decades ago, when you talk about white flight, to the suburbs, and, that was something that was very obvious. But again, I think that comes to, well, this isn't, a racist movement. We had white flight. This is just people handling their business, taking care of their families. So again, going back to what Kyle said, I think you were right about how are we viewing these systems and how these systems operate? Is there any level of racism that's going on? And again, if you're not experiencing it, you may even understand what racism in that system looks like, but you don't necessarily know that you're seeing it when you are, because you haven't experienced it yourself. You're going to say something.
Yeah, so kind of something to think about is when we think about U.S. territories, a lot of them islands, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands, U.S. Samoa. Throughout history, these are all places with brown people. And throughout history, only one of them did we ever turn into a state, and that was Hawaii. And that was after the state was memorialized by being attacked by the Japanese and starting World War II. Why is it that we never decided were we satisfied with an even 50, or why did we never take the steps to try to do the same thing for the other ones? And I just want people to reflect on that and think about it.
Mm-hmm. So what are the questions, that I think we saw more of this type of terminology and language used when we were looking at the LGBT community, when we're talking about allies, those who are of, different demographics, but are trying to effectively, efficiently support minorities. I think there's a fine line there between somebody who comes in as a white ally, best intentions, trying to help, but then again, it's not necessarily oppression, but it is somebody who is making the movement on their own terms, in their own way, and now there's a dependency on that person to continue to be actively engaged versus being able to walk alongside. Some people have argued there's still people who are moving in front with people of color moving behind them. Do you see that? Do you think that that's an issue that, how do you ask somebody to get involved, but not so much so that now we have a new way of not necessarily oppressing, but not allowing equal contribution from the people they're supposed to be advocating for?
Well, first of all, the principle of an ally, Jamil Al-Amin, the former H. Rap Brown, put it very succinctly. If you are doing something to help me, then essentially you take your guidance from me. I don't know that the problem today is white leadership of black social movements, of black institutions, et cetera, et cetera. I do think that there's a problem with white liberals and white progressives that's critical, and it's that essentially it's what Andy Young said. You can't tell them anything. They have a view, and they're prepared to pursue their view and interpretation without consultation with the people who are oppressed. And therefore, they constantly make things, if not worse for us, more difficult, because we have to deal with how do we get them out of the way so we can handle our business.
I've never seen it, but I've always hated the Sandra Bullock movie, The Blind Side.
Yeah.
And it's this, white people love to save black people. And I guess we're at a better point that white people actually care to an extent about saving black people, but we still have a lot of ways to go. When you think about so many aspects of our society, how many TV dramas star black men? How many Hollywood movies star black men? Besides Denzel Washington and Will Smith, who's out there. And it's deeply, we talk about education and law enforcement and, these certain institutional things, but it's part of our culture. It's part of our entertainment. And I think that the problem here is that, we have this corporate-driven market where they say, well, the majority of the viewers out there are white, so let's just only tell white people's stories. Let's only humanize that. Let's only talk about that. And so, yeah, I think that there's a lot that we can do in that regard as far as what presentations are we putting out there? What are we glamorizing, And I think just in general for white people, I think that you have to sort of warrant that you don't get it. That if something is said to you and it doesn't make sense and it might even make you feel defensive because you feel in some way you're indirectly being called racist, so it's so natural to reject it. But you just have to accept that you don't get it and accept that the person who is of that group and is saying something is offensive is the definition of what makes something offensive or what makes something wrong. Like, I can't think of it any other way to explain what offensive means other than that it offends somebody. Mm-hmm. And so when a white person says something that's offensive towards black people is not offensive, it blows my mind. So I think that until people really start accepting that this is real, just because people aren't getting their crosses burned on their lawn, focusing on the private acts or the acts of individuals that shock us, it's a damn shame that it took, a kid going into a church and shooting half a dozen or so black people for people to realize, oh my God, the Confederate flag is horrible. I grew up with this idea of like, why do people have that? Why are we talking about that? Like, whoa, they could just do that? Mm-hmm. And even around here, you'd see people wear belt buckles or something like that would go unquestioned. And it was never this idea of, wait a minute, that was a war waged on racism. Why are we not equating this to a swastika? And, we don't focus on the big picture. And I think that's part of it, is just not getting it.
So I think that's one of the challenges that we see. Like you were saying, wealth is inherited, poverty is inherited, racism is inherited. Where are you learning it from? You're learning it from your family. You're learning it from your community. And you're essentially inheriting that because you're typically growing up the same place that your parents grew up. And even if you're removed, you're still influenced by your friends and your family. And so I think that's the challenge, that when it comes to accountability or being able to recognize that any of your behavior could even be remotely interpreted as racist, I think it's very hard for people to see that because they have gone a long time with that behavior being unchecked, because in their community, in their, however you want to call it, their bubble, that's not racist behavior. That's just how you are. Like having a Confederate flag, there's some patriotism around that. Or there's, another guise that it can be, brushed under, where I think that's another challenge that we have. I've had parents who have reached out and said, I worry my child isn't empathetic enough. They're not displaying behavior that, makes me think they're going to be, warm and fuzzy around most of the people around them. How do I change that? So when we try to look at this, are we looking at, encouraging people to expose themselves to different demographics, volunteering, getting in the field? I mean, at some point they have to be able to have an experience of some type that should give them that appreciation that they're not going to have in their everyday life. It's just never going to cross their path because they're sitting in a place of privilege that will usually make it pretty difficult for them to have to, for instance, how do I, I don't have to worry about paying my rent or feeding my children, or I don't have the dream of being able to afford going back to school because I have 3 children and I'm a single parent. You see what I'm saying? They're not having to have those different types of dilemmas going on in their life.
You see, we have one central institution that's supposed to help us resolve that question. And it's not the family, it's not the local community, it's the educational system. And whatever people get in school, in the home life, I believe is trumped by what happens in the educational system. And so we have an educational system that is absolutely dedicated and committed to the maintenance of a racial hierarchy. Now, you take the president of the University of Illinois, what is his name? Tim Kaine. Kaine's essential position is absolutely and totally racist. His defense of the First Amendment and this notion of free speech. Speech is free. Now, so when you say that you only respond to hostile and hate speech with better speech, what they're essentially saying is this, from the context of the University of Illinois, that when these white fraternities and sororities decide to do their racial-themed parties, Black people and Latino people, we are merely to hold a rally and condemn it. And the university takes no action against them. They may, in fact, say that you need education. They may say that they should go to some sensitivity class, but they won't shut it down, right? They would defend it. Every time you hear a university administrator, whether it's the deeply, vehemently anti-Black racist Phyllis Wise, who, praise everyone that she is gone. She was absolute, so anti-Black that you could feel it when you were in her presence. Well, Kylie and them are a little more subtle, a little more sophisticated, but their position becomes the same. So when it's about Black people and brown people, you can use racial slurs. They just want to condemn it as bad. Okay? But when it comes to something that they call cyberbullying, that happens to white middle-class kids, then suddenly we can legislate against that, right? And that's the difference, that they're willing to always put another value above in privilege, above the treatment or mistreatment of Black folk. And until we're able to say, no, your notion of free speech does not trump our right not to be assaulted, verbally insulted, and abused, right? Until that central point gets made across this country, we're going to be stuck with these racist monuments. You're going to be stuck with classrooms at the University of Illinois where white kids make racist statements and the professor just moves on, right? Or puts pressure on the 2 or 3 Black kids in there to respond. And when they do respond, and the white kids respond to them, act like it's just a civil debate. Mm-hmm. Well, when you move to the racial slur, I have to say, I reserve the right to beat your ass. You understand what I'm saying? Because these racial slurs lead to creating a climate in which racism is normalized, and the outcome of that climate is genocide against the American Indians, enslavement of Black people, and genocide against Jews. That's the outcome of allowing that stuff to fester and saying something stupid like you respond to hate speech with more speech. Even the right-wing Supreme Court said that if you burn a cross on somebody's lawn, that is illegal, right? In the civilized world, the United Kingdom and Germany, racial slurs are outlawed. No, you make a racial slur, you pay a fine, you go to you got jail time. We have to stop that. We have to make certain things illegal. That's my position.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I would like to see, which is, why this was the topic of the show tonight, is just to have conversation. I think we've moved away from having civilized conversation. People are going to come to the table, they're going to have different ideas of what racism is. But until you start having those conversations, we can all say what the reality is of racism in the country, but it varies from, region to region, city to city, what we see in Champaign versus maybe a town that's 40 miles away. I think what we need to do is be able to have this conversation in a very raw and candid way, because even if you disagree with somebody, that is still the reality of your society, what their opinion is. 10 to 1, they're not the only person who feels that way. So how do we begin to have these discussions where we can start moving to a place where we don't have to agree, Kyle was saying, I don't think we're ever going to cross the finish line, but move into a better, healthier climate where the one place where our children should always feel safe is our schools. And so we need to be able to have discussions so that we can create climates, not just for the students, but for the teachers, because if they're, trying to support, they want to be an ally in this, we need to be able to support them, from administrators, from district administrators, and not just the education system. Wherever we can have this situation where people are saying, we want to be able to step up, have our voice, not be stifled, and say, we recognize racism happening in this company, in this system. We want to be able to address it, but not have it be one of those things where their concern is it's opening a floodgate, and now they have in turn become the minority because they're supporting a minority. So I think that's, hopefully what we can do, with different conversations that we have locally with things like the Champaign County Racial Justice Task Force, different groups who are kind of coming together to say, we're going to start looking at what racism looks like in our backyard and how we can start addressing those types of things. Definitely thank you guys for coming on the show today. I think this is the tip of the iceberg. I think we need to continue to have this discussion. This is definitely not the last one, but hopefully the first of many conversations that we can have, as well as the specific issues that also accompany, racism. One of the things I'm going to be talking about in a few shows is mental health, and specifically how that system works with minority groups, because I think that's a very important, situation we need to start looking at, and how there's either access or there isn't access. So definitely thank you guys for being on the show tonight. And for our listeners and watchers on Facebook, you've just listened to In the Know on WEFT 90.1. This evening's show will be archived on radiofreeamerica.com, as well as my personal Facebook page. You can also find the video on Tumblr at In the Know 217. Next week, I'll have guests to discuss the TV series 13 Reasons Why. Guests will include Sheila Ferguson from Rosecrans, Stacey McNichol from the Rock Group, Julie Karsten from Elliott Counseling. We'll also have a lot of different shows that are going to be discussing some very hard-hitting topics. Again, we encourage listeners to, tune in. Definitely listen for the guests if you want to follow up with them. I'm sure gentlemen would be happy to respond to any questions or comments that people have. But we hope that you guys continue to tune into the radio show. Thank you again, guys, for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Who is that?
Oh,
basically.
Beth, so you know that last part was deliberate because we try to send a message to Kylie before he does this dumb stuff.
No. That's part of what the show is.
Juliet's coming in, like immediately. This is going to be a weird transition between you guys.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Yeah, please.
Before you guys go to fun frequencies.
Sorry about that. I just put another underwriting.
And let me guess, it's 7:01, almost 7:02.
We'll make sure it's
You said it wouldn't run over.
I lied.
Yeah.
I apologize.
Not that I'm holding you personally responsible, but
It's her.
it's just, I didn't think it was going to work that way.
It's her first show. We'll make sure we get things timed a little
It's just
better.
I'm really tight this week, so it's going to run into Tammy's show now.
I understand.
I mean Jess's show.
Yes. Jess's show.